But you observe what is the impact on the ground, especially for migrants? I mean, does that mean that migration process become more complicated because you have to go through training, and or actually
Well,
they're genuinely becoming more safer, not necessarily. But I think the example you mentioned was interesting. The compensation claim, maybe the more mechanisms for postal home. The remedy and etc. But then it also make develop a new type of relations between migrants with the host society, right? You need a certain one or organization to help you to claim compensation. And so the right is not something really you carry, you can exercise automatically, but the right is something you can claim in a situation that your right is deprived. Then of course you have to rely on someone else in order to claim. I mean, so because this may give us some prediction about the future of a securitization of mobility after COVID. What will happen to migrants?
Yes. So this is just to follow up on that last point you made there. What is interesting, and this has to do with this temporal thing, right? So on the one hand, in theory, you would imagine that safe migration discourses will really sort of in a way mirror these sort of anticipatory logic that securitization discourses would suggest. But what I found in my research was that often is the reactive that it works with. So for example, in theory, right? So say if you have a passport, you would think that you already have a legal status, and that will mean that you're not going to be abused and these kinds of things. Now it's very difficult in a quantitative sense to really measure these kinds of things. But a lot of research, not just my own, but a range of other research, seems to suggest that legal status is by no means really securing these things. But yes, what is interesting, and this is something I found in the study, is that it seems to have some impact on how people can react and act on cases. So you can imagine a difference if you're undocumented compared to being documented. And say if you call an NGO and seek assistance, and this is actually one of these things I found with hotlines. So an important effect of hotlines for migrants is that it leads to deportations, especially if they're undocumented. So they're meant to help migrants, but through this sort of counter-intentional effects almost, they result in deportations. Back to the compensation claim. So yes, so it's a mixed result, right? So on the one hand, there is certainly some leverage for NGOs in order to assist migrants with these kinds of things. In practice, though, it's very difficult to actually succeed fully with compensation claims. So, employees find ways around it. They go bankrupt, right, or whatever, and then enforcing payments is very difficult. What happens in practice is that very often, and many NGOs are engaging in this actually, where they end up with informal settlements before they come to court. Because the problem with taking things to court, back to this point about temporality and being stuck and having to wait, if you're going to pursue something through the courts, it's going to take a very long time and you risk losing everything. You might be unsuccessful. But if you engage in an informal negotiation, it's a much higher. Many of these NGOs are very, very successful in actually succeeding with informal settlements. The catch is of course, that the payment of the settlement is much less than what the migrants are actually entitled to. But so it's kind of a mixed scoreboard. This takes me to another main finding from my research on safe migration, and that is that, as I said, you have these informal negotiated settlements. And one of the big things I found throughout all of this is that all those safe migration policies and programs are meant to strengthen the formal regulatory environments around labor migration to ensure safety. A lot of these things in practice are heavily underpinned by a range of informal practices. One of them, the key things, has to do with brokers and brokerage. So let me quickly give you some examples because they are very interesting. So say, what I discovered over time doing my research was that say you have NGOs and other local community-based organizations. When you get to know what they do over time, you get to know more about what they do. I gradually discovered that sometimes you would have field officers working for NGOs and community organizations who had previous histories as labor brokers and recruiters. So, for example, one of my informants, he used to, well, you know, in legal terms, he would be a people smuggler. He would have brought in lots of people from Myanmar and used to be a broker, but now he worked as an NGO person, right? So I discovered that, you know, you had former brokers becoming NGO officials, and the other way around sometimes. So you'd had a NGO outreach worker becoming a broker. And so that's an interesting thing, how a lot of these you know, the way assistance is provided piggybacks on and depends to some extent on brokers and brokerage. And I interviewed a broker about this one who described this. So the question is why? Why is it that an NGO is employing a broker, right, to help migrants? And the answer was very poetic. The broker told me that, well, if you want to, in order to what was the saying? It was you have to enter the tiger's cage in order to save the cub. That was the so in other words, the point is that, you know, a broker, you have to know the enemy in a way, right? So if you're gonna, you know, be able to reach migrant communities, and many migrants who might have ambiguous or maybe undocumented legal status, they're afraid of authorities, etc., etc. You know, brokers have all the skill sets in order to connect and access and be able to navigate these worlds, right? But then you have other examples of brokerage. So for example, say you have I talked about pre-departure training and so forth. Say you have an NGO running a training on a Sunday say in Bangkok with migrants, right? To teach them about, say, for example, visa processing. How do you change work permits, or, you know, things like this, right? The idea, of course, is that this kind of information will assist the migrants with becoming less dependent on brokers and therefore more safety, right? You create autonomous migrants through this kind of training where they can understand all this themselves. Guess who comes to the training? Quite often, either participants or become brokers, because again, this information, you know, how to change a visa or whatever, this is very useful information for brokers to know. I interviewed one of the trainers for one of these training sessions who told me that in some cases, this person believed that more than 50% of the attendees would be either already be or becoming brokers. And so the point here is that a lot of these activities in practice, they produce brokerage practices and brokers, and indeed depend on them. Now, is this good or bad for migrants? A bit of both, right? What's interesting, of course, is that a lot of these activities that are being rolled out often do indeed help migrants. But the scorecard is often mixed, right? So as I said before, say these informal compensation claims that are negotiated, are they good or bad? I mean, it's a bit of both, you know, the migrants get a bit of benefit out of them, but they don't get all of the benefit. And indeed, sometimes, ironically, the settlement is below the formal minimum. So let's say a wage dispute, for example, sometimes the compensation claim is actually below what the migrant is entitled to through the stipulated minimum wage, which is a terrible result on the one hand, but on the other hand, the migrants get at least something, right? So this is, I guess, my argument with safe migration is that it is a form of brokered safety, right? Where both the practice of it is brokered, but the outcome too is also negotiated and therefore a brokered kind of outcome. And that's all what I'm outlining, of course, in my book. That is, it's just about to be honest, I should know this, but I'm not entirely sure when it comes out. It's very soon. It's, I think, within weeks or something. It should
what
be
is
out.
the title of the book?
Brokered safety and the politics of safe migration in Southeast Asia.
Brokerage and the politics of safe migration.
Brokered safety and the politics of safe migration.
Okay, yeah, great.
And that's the argument of the book, basically, that safe migration is brokered safety.
No, that's a very interesting point and very relevant to our program as well here. And now I think, you know, we have thinking of securitization or more generally, governance of mobility, at least now we see 4 logics, which are not separate from each other, but they are really intertwined. The territorial, which is based on demarcating borders and demarcating space and single out a particular group, etc. Second, the logistical, which is about the tracing and monitoring mobility process itself. And thirdly, welfare provision is based on, welfare provision probably you can say is a kind of reactive but need-based way to regulate mobility to address the result of mobility rather than anticipatory to start with. And now actually, the fourth logic is, for the lack of better word, is the social, right? All this brokerage, how things are actually being done, negotiated. And this logic is always, by definition, of course, fuzzy and difficult to articulate, but it's always there. It is actually infrastructure of all other logics to come to alive. So thank you very much, Sverre. That is a very rich conversation. And you in Canberra, in your daughter's room. I am in Berlin, in my daughter's room too. So,
okay.
So big hello to your daughter. And yeah, so we'll definitely continue the conversation. Hopefully next time we'll be in a face-to-face format.
Yes, let's hope so. That would be lovely. And thank you so much for inviting me and to have me on this video podcast.
Yeah, pleasure.
Thank you.